Hi there and welcome to another A-Tippling Philosopher video with me, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is the third in a series dealing with slavery and biblical ethics, which is to say it's mainly about how biblical scholars are dealing or have dealt with the subject of slavery. So not so much about going through the Bible and looking for biblical quotes as to, how slavery is countenanced in the Bible, so on and so forth, but the reaction of biblical scholars and theologians and apologists thereafter. This is the third video. The first one was an introduction. The second one was looking briefly at three types of biblical hermeneutics. That means the way that scholars interpret the Bible and the techniques they use to interpret it in order to maintain, well, they don't see it as in order to maintain, but how biblical apologetics and biblical scholarship works is using mechanisms to allow the Bible to maintain its moral excellence, and that allows Jesus and God to be, maintaining them as morally perfect. Okay, so that's the goal. The goal is that God and the Bible need to remain up here, and so therefore any technique that allows that to remain the case is useful. And so the three techniques we see in biblical scholarship with regard to slavery appear to be, as I said, representativism. So that one is about cherry picking. It's saying this verse represents the true moral teachings of the Bible, or it represents true Christianity or the truth of God. But we're going to forget this excerpt, and we're going to forget this chapter and this verse. This one that I first mentioned is one that truly represents the Bible and what it truly says. And that's basically cherry picking. So it's saying this one, and as I said, in terms of Islam, we can see that it's like Islam is a religion of peace, and that's because this verse and this verse support that, but it's forgetting that verse and that verse and that verse. So that's representativism. And then there's trajectorialism, which is it's all on a trajectory, and this is the one we're going to concentrate most on in this video, which is to say that the Bible and thus Christianity are the necessary starting point or component in that trajectory up to abolition. So the abolition of slavery wouldn't have happened without the Bible, without Christianity. Okay. And that's a huge problem because it's involved in countenancing and justifying slavery. So, and then the other one is reinterpretation, which is to say, yeah, that's how you used to interpret the Bible, but actually you were wrong, and this is how it should be interpreted. Or that it's a living document, and we're good. It's good and proper to reinterpret it for the new audience in current ways. Okay, so that's reinterpretation. So trajectorialism. Now I'm going to show you a couple of sort of mocked up graphs I've done just to show you that how it works. So this first one looks at, this is the reality, is that the Bible sits in the middle of moral progress, and it does play a part, and it is important, and our morality has been largely influenced by biblical ethics and by the moral progress. I would argue that is just human moral progress, and if it hadn't been Christianity, it would have been some other religion. It just so happens that was a particular religion that took on the ideas of moral progress. Now, what apologists see is not this first graph, where we have the Bible's nestled and Christianity nestled in that trajectory. Very often Christians, apologists will see the Bible as the foundation. And so this second graph shows that t equals 16. I just made that up. That's just a time stamp. Now moves right to the beginning of the graph, because the Bible is the foundation. And so without the Bible, you wouldn't have got all the rest of this stuff, right? You wouldn't have got all the rest of the progress that happens up until now. So the Bible is the fundamental starting point for modern ethics and for, in this case, the abolition of slavery. And this is the key point to this video that I'm doing now. And what we're going to look at is how really we need to go back to the first graph and show that actually there was stuff that pre-existed the biblical claims, but also the Christian claims. So it's not just about this. These ideas existed before the Bible. Many of them did. But it's also that these ideas existed outside of the Christian worldview and existed before Christian ethics developed them. Okay, so there'll be certain Greek and Roman thinking that what happens is Christian apologists laud Christianity for when they see these ideas in Christianity, but kind of ignore that they existed within Roman and Greek thought before they existed in Christian thought, and not as a result of the Bible. So that's really what we're going to be doing in this video. Now, another point I'm going to make about this video, or a point I'm going to make, is that I will be doing quite a bit of reading from this chapter. Now, in previous videos, I could sort of summarize the chapters in my own words, but there's so much content in here and so many quotes that need to be made that I will be referring either to Hector Aavros's core text himself, stuff that he's written. And remember, this is because what we're doing is a book club, really. So this is Slavery, Abolitionism and the Ethics of Biblical Scholarship. So I'll either be quoting from him or quoting from the sources that he quotes from himself. So what Aavlos is looking to show is that these ideas, as mentioned, existed or pre-existed or existed outside of Christian thoughts and biblical thought, and that you don't necessarily have to think about the legal codes within which some of these ideas were set, because so you might have the Code of Hammurabi that has an awful lot of stuff in, and you can almost just forget the whole context, because let's just look at this single idea about this single legal code, and did it exist outside of biblical thought? Yes. Okay. So don't bog yourself down with the Code of Hammurabi, for example, or any other legal code as a whole. Let's just look at these ideas. Did these ideas exist outside of Christian or biblical thought? And if they did, then it isn't Christian or biblical thought that is the necessary starting point for these ideas. These ideas existed outside of that. And as Aavlos says on page 39, yet we still witness modern historians and biblical scholars diminishing the ethical accomplishments of Mesopotamia in order to make the Bible look superior. That's really the core of what's going on here. Remember, the Bible needs to stay up here. So they'll do anything to keep the Bible up here. Consider Alan Dershowitz, the famed legal scholar at Harvard Law School, in speaking of the biblical achievements in law. He points to lex talionis. So lex talionis is super important. It's the eye, this is me talking, it's the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth law, right? And it can be exemplified in a number of different ways. So you can say, right, I'm going to simplify this really easily. Like, you punch me in the face, I'm going to punch you in the face, right? Okay, that broadly makes a bit of sense, right? But it can also be seen in other ways, which is to say that you murdered my daughter, therefore I'm going to murder your daughter. And of course, the problem there is that your daughter has nothing to do with this moral exchange, with these events. And yet I can use your daughter as a way of getting justice for myself against you, right? So that's another sort of iteration of the lex talionis. Anyway, sorry, to go back to the quote. He points to lex talionis, the principle that a perpetrator should suffer an analogous injury to the victim. Dershowitz realizes that this principle already existed in the Code of Hammurabi. So this is a Mesopotamian law code that existed before the Bible, a long time before the Bible. In the 18th century BCE. Dershowitz tells us why that code does not quite measure up to the Bible's articulation of that principle. Quote, and this is from Dershowitz, the Code of Hammurabi adumbrated this concept, but without regard to individual culpability. For example, Hammurabi ordered the killing of the daughter of a man who has killed another's daughter, so as I was saying. Yet it does not seem to bother Dershowitz, this is back to Aavlos, that the Ten Commandments begins with the principle of collective punishment in Exodus 25. Quote, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me. So that's Noah's flood. So what this says is that Dershowitz says, look at the Bible. It's yes, okay, lex talionis existed in Code of Hammurabi, but here we've got, visiting, justice by, taking revenge on the person who committed the first injustice of killing your own daughter by killing their daughter. That's really unfair. The Bible doesn't do that. And then Aavlos says, yes, it does. Quite obviously, Ten Commandments, and here we have in Exodus 20 that God visiting, the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third or fourth generation. So, it's fundamental to the Bible. And then Aavlos goes on, page 40 now, to talk about Rodney Stark. So Rodney Stark, as mentioned before, is really a sociologist, but has become like a spokesperson for Christian apologetics in terms of history of the religion. He's written a bunch of books. He's not a historian, but written a bunch of books on the history of Christianity and how it's achieved X, Y, and Z, and how it initially became to be this successful religion it became. But he's not a historian, and he treats his sources really badly, and he basically uses pretty dodgy historiography. And Aavlos, is looking to people like this and putting them in his crosshairs, because he's like, you are misrepresenting what's going on, and you are relaying to your audience that abolitionism and the abolition of slavery was as a result of Christianity, and in doing so, you are misrepresenting the truth. So this is what Rodney Stark says in his book For the Glory of God, page 325, and he quotes a guy called Mendelssohn, who we'll come across quite a bit. So Stark says, there is no record that any philosopher in Sumer, Babylon or Assyria ever protested against slavery. It's hugely important. No one protested against slavery. And this is where he quotes Mendelssohn. Nor is there any expression of the mildest sympathy for the victims of this system. Slavery was simply taken for granted. Back to Stark. Indeed, the Code of Hammurabi, around 1750 BC, prescribed death for anyone who helped a slave escape. And Aavlos takes umbrage at this. He takes aim at this quote, and he says, but what is a source for such a sweeping generalization? Stark's footnotes show very little acquaintance with the literature of Mesopotamia, and no specific edition of this Code of Hammurabi is cited. This is really, really important. Like, Stark is making these big claims that so many Christians rely on. Christian apologists are. Rodney Stark, shows that X, Y, and Z, and that Christianity is responsible for the ethical advance of humanity. But the work he does just doesn't do justice to any kind of quality historical techniques. So he continues, Stark cites no specific law number in the CH in the Code of Hammurabi. His quote actually incorporates another quote found in Isaac Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn's Slavery in the Ancient Near East. Both Epstein, who's another scholar, and David B. Davis, another scholar, repeat the very same quote from Mendelssohn. So this is the problem. So you've got one scholar using another scholar to base their opinions and theories, and that first scholar is not doing good work. And this Isaac Mendelssohn quote is a problem because it gets used by a lot of Christian apologists. Aavlos talks about Orlando Patterson not only quoting Mendelssohn but completely misrepresenting him in a chapter subtitled Why Freedom Failed in a Non-Western World. So in particular, Patterson appeals to Mendelssohn to characterize Mesopotamian attitudes towards freedom, and he does so as follows. And this is another sort of Christian scholar incorrectly using sources. Quote, "It is remarkable that, although the laws made provision for manumission, so manumission is a freedom of slaves, there is a, quote, conspicuous absence of manumission documents in the hundreds of business records which have survived from ancient and Neo-Babylonian times." And that's taken from Patterson's book Freedom, page 35. And he's citing Mendelssohn's Slavery in the Ancient Near East. Now, this idea that there's a conspicuous absence of manumission documents in the hundreds of business records which have survived from ancient and Neo-Babylonian times is something of a problem. So Aavlos says, you know, that quote from Mendelssohn is a misquote. So the actual quote part from Mendelssohn is a conspicuous absence of manumission documents, end quote. So that's the only bit from Mendelssohn. And Aavlos says Mendelssohn was discussing Law 117 of the Code of Hammurabi, which pertained to wives and children who were handed over to creditors as pledges. And this law specified that they had to be freed after 3 years of service. Okay, so straight away you've got manumission. All right, that's the Law 117 of the Code of Hammurabi. Mendelssohn then speculates about whether this specific law was applied in reality. So it's not that this law didn't exist. What Mendelssohn's saying is like, yeah, it existed, but we don't have any evidence that anyone actually did that, which is quite interesting. The later scholars are interpreting Mendelssohn as saying this is evidence that the law didn't exist, rather than it truly saying this is just a lack of evidence that people adhered to the laws. So Mendelssohn actually says whether the law was ever enforced in life, however, is highly doubtful. We have numerous documents from ancient and Neo-Babylonia attesting to the widespread practice of selling or handing over wives and children to creditors, but documents of their release after the 3-year term of servitude are conspicuous by their absence. And that was Mendelssohn in his book Slavery in the Ancient Near East, page 75. So what this is saying is that we just don't have the evidence that people let them go. And as I say, Patterson has transformed the absence of documents relating to the 3-year term of servitude to a conspicuous absence of manumission documents of any type, right? That there's no evidence that manumission took place at all in every period, right? Ancient and Neo-Babylonian times. But Mendelssohn's only talking about the Code of Hammurabi here. He's actually only talking about one law code in the Code of Hammurabi. And then Patterson has taken that comment and applied it right across the ancient Near East and saying that it pertains to the idea that there are no documents talking about manumission at all. And it's this kind of dishonest work that Aavlos is fighting really hard against. As he says on page 41, this sort of dependence on secondary sources is part of an endemic problem in scholarship because few scholars are able to read all the languages required to check the primary sources, and time or expertise cannot be obtained in every area of history. Yet the fact remains that not checking the primary sources yields some of these flawed comparisons. In the case of Patterson, this supposed absence of manumission documents in Mesopotamia allows him to erase Mesopotamia from making any contribution and to give greater credit to the Bible and Christianity. So this allows Patterson, for example, to take that trajectory and move it down. To say the Bible started it all. He's forgetting Mesopotamia existed. He's saying there are no documents supporting manumission, which is incorrect. It's just simply incorrect. As Aavlos says, the Code of Hammurabi was a very important accomplishment in terms of both law and ethics. It not only showed how dependent biblical law was on Mesopotamian precedents, but it had many features extolled by biblical scholars when they appear in the Bible. And he goes on to quote the Code of Hammurabi and show that a bunch of things. So six things that the Code of Hammurabi clearly enunciates as principles. And these 6 things are: 1, to make justice shine forth in the land. This comes from the prologue of the Code of Hammurabi. So this is just from the prologue. 2, to destroy the wicked and evildoers. 3, so that the strong should not harm the weak. Wow, that's a big principle. But only the Bible does that, right? 4, so that I should rule over the black-headed people like Shamash and illuminate the land. 5, to further the well-being of humankind. And 6, to protect widows and orphans. That's actually from the epilogue. So, the Code of Hammurabi, just on its own, and forgetting all the other numerous law codes that are out there, appears to completely, destroy the case that Christianity and the Bible are the starting point for this moral progress. It's kind of biblical exceptionalism. And then before the Hammurabi, you've got the law codes, another law code. There are many law codes. This one, Lipit Ishtar. He was actually a king who reigned in southern Mesopotamia. In the prologue, the legal law codes of Lipit Ishtar say, I liberated the sons and daughters of the city of Nippur, the sons and daughters of the city of Ur, the sons and daughters of the city of Isin, and the sons and daughters of the lands of Sumer and Akkad, who were subjugated by the yoke, and I restored order. In other words, he freed slaves. As Aavlos says, these ideas of liberation are premised on sympathy for the enslaved, and if one were to follow the liberatory trajectory model, so that's kind of what I explained earlier, then one could just as well argue that modern abolitionism was simply the culmination of a trajectory that had started with Lipit Ishtar. So it's not the Bible that's at the beginning of that trajectory, it's the law codes of Lipit Ishtar. And a further problem for scholars and apologists who rely on people like Mendelssohn for their understanding of ancient Near Eastern law codes is that Mendelssohn's book, I think, was 1949, and there have been discoveries since then and better translations of law codes since then. So, in fact, one of the big law codes, I think, was discovered in 1948, so didn't even have access, didn't even know that. Mendelssohn. So if you're relying on the claims of Mendelssohn, then he didn't have nearly half the knowledge we have these days about the ancient Near Eastern law codes. And that's a real problem. As Aavlos says on page 42, important law codes and fragments of law codes have been discovered or published in more accessible editions since the time of Mendelssohn. Thus, Stark and Davis continue to cite an outdated source because they are not reading the latest reviews or journals in biblical studies. They're relying on, books from older apologists or older books from apologists in times gone past that are just not representative of the best knowledge in the area. The historical record shows Stark to be wrong. In a work titled Advice to a Prince, a Mesopotamian Sage Warns the King, and I'll put this up on the screen. This is from a translation by W.G. Lambert from Babylonian Wisdom Literature in 1960. If he mobilized the whole of Sippar, Nippur and Babylon and imposed forced labor on the people, exacting from them a corvée at the herald's proclamation, Marduk, the sage of the gods, the prince, the counsellor, will turn his land over to his enemy, so that the troops of of his land will do forced labour for his enemy, for Anu, Enlil, and I don't know how to pronounce that. The great gods who dwell in heaven and earth in their assembly affirm the freedom of those people from such obligations. Aavlos says, so we see that the king is not supposed to be some arbitrary ruler that is allowed to enslave his people. The gods have affirmed the freedom of the people, and they are there to enforce it with the harshest penalties for despotic rulers. This is no different from the curses imposed for bad behaviour in Deuteronomy 28. And that predates the Bible. So, again, the trajectory from the first graph is correct, and what Christians try to do in taking on that second graph is incorrect. So Lambert, as I said, who was the translator there, himself then said, the editor of many of these Mesopotamian texts, himself comments, and this is from page 110 of his book, Babylonian Wisdom Literature, says, the impression is sometimes gained that ancient Mesopotamian kings were typical Oriental despots, following their own whims and unchallenged within their domains. In contrast, the Hebrew prophets fearlessly denounced their kings for any abuse of power. The advice, which is the translation he just made, the advice to a prince, the advice serves as a salutary corrective to this exaggerated contrast. Wow. So back in 1960, he was saying that this idea that the Hebrew prophets were some kind of step change in ethics with regard to, subjugation and rulers and abuse of power is incorrect or grossly exaggerated. As Aavlos says, in other words, Rodney Stark falls into a very basic chauvinistic trap, which assumes that polytheistic societies are somehow less humane in not recognising oppression, even if they did not outlaw it in any more than the Bible did. While Stark asserts that no protests are recorded in ancient Mesopotamia, the fact that some Mesopotamian laws allowed slaves to protest about their condition through legal means. For example, in a series of directives about fugitive slaves being harboured by persons other than their owner, Law 14 of the Code of Lipit Ishtar states, quote, if a man's slave contests his slave status against his master, and it is proven that his master has been compensated for his slavery twofold, that slave shall be freed. One could easily cite this law as both unique and advanced, because we had not witnessed such rights given to slaves anywhere else before. So if you are going to move the Bible and biblical thought to the bottom of this trajectory and say the abolition is effectively founded by being the culmination of the trajectory that started with the Bible, you are being wrong, just flat wrong, because many of the codes we see in the Bible, detailing forms of manumission, forms of freedom of slaves, were found in previous law codes. So if you are to say Christianity and the Bible are necessary components of abolitionism, as Rodney Stark does, in fact the foundation of abolitionism, then you would be just flat out wrong. And that's not even bringing into the conversation Egypt, Rome and Greek. That's just the ancient Near East, and there's much more that could be said on the ancient Near East, but now we're going to have a little hop across to Egypt. So what does Rodney Stark, have to say about Egypt? Well, in For the Glory of God, Stark, and this is Aavlos saying, applauds the values of the Judeo-Christian tradition and attempts to combat any notion that non-biblical religions were nearly as ethical. In the case of Egypt, Stark tells us, quote, and this is from page 326 of For the Glory of God by Rodney Stark, the many gods of Egypt were not thought to concern themselves with how humans treated one another. It's a really sweeping statement, okay? Just like, oh, the Egyptian gods weren't bothered with how humans treated each other. Stark's claim, says Aavlos, is patently false if one studies Egyptian literature even at a most superficial level. And he goes on to detail how in the Book of the Dead, you know, one of the most famous Egyptian source, literary source, obviously counteracts what Rodney Stark is saying here. So here, from the Book of the Dead, here's just one quote. "I've acted rightly in Egypt. I have not cursed a god. I have done what people speak of, what the gods are pleased with. I've given bread to the hungry." So obviously here the gods are pleased with this behaviour. "I've given bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty, clothes to the naked, a ferry boat to the boatless. I have given divine offerings to the gods." So, you know, it's not as if Christianity or the Bible invented morality. We have a moral trajectory and huge amounts of moral literature predates the Bible. I mean, bear in mind that the Bible is written in the exilic period, you know, 500, 600 BCE, and arguably up to, you know, 300 BCE. It was pretty late. And there's an awful lot of literature from the ancient Near East and from Egypt, and not to mention further east. So he goes later in the chapter, I won't really detail, but he just mentions the fact that it seems that the biblical scholars just stop moving eastwards at the ancient Near East. They don't go on to the Orient, to the Far East, and you know, further afield. So the idea that Christianity is this foundation stone of morality and ethics is really, really problematic. And you know, and there's lots more can be said about the Book of the Dead, but there's another book called or work called The Instructions of Amenemope, and it bears really great similarities to sort of biblical ethics. So here's a quote from that book. "Beware of robbing a wretch or of attacking a cripple. Don't stretch out your hand to touch an old man, nor open your mouth to an elder. Don't let yourself be sent on a mischievous errand, nor be friends with him who does it. Don't raise an outcry against one who attacks you, nor answer him yourself." So many biblical scholars, the reason why this is important is that actually this is a direct source of some biblical proverbs. So many biblical scholars realize that Proverbs 22:20, which refers to the 30 sayings, is probably a reference to the 30 chapters that compose Amenemope. Indeed, some of these instructions are so similar, this is page 44 by the way, to what we find in Proverbs that the New American Bible, a Catholic version, inserts Amenemope into the biblical text in Proverbs 22:19. Quote, "I make known to you the words of Amenemope." So the dependence on Proverbs of Amenemope is now recognised routinely in modern biblical studies. Indeed, by 1951, John A. Wilson, the distinguished Egyptologist, for example, remarked, quote, "We believe that there is a direct connection between these two pieces of wisdom literature, and that Amenemopet was the ancestor text. The secondary nature of the Hebrew seems established. Both texts, maybe as late as the 7th or 6th century BC. So you've got the biblical texts for their moral and ethical views, in this particular case, depending on a primary source, an Egyptian text. So there you go. So, and then moving on from Egyptians to the Hittites, who were a civilization from the 2nd millennium BCE in the ancient Near East, I think mainly around Turkey, their capital in Hattusa in Turkey, and sort of Afghanistan, I think they did trade with that way. So, you know, Turkey area. So Aavlos says about the Hittites, and they had their own law code. The Hittite law code is another, like the Code of Hammurabi, Lippet Ishtar, Ur-Nummu, and the Hittite law codes. The major law codes that pre-existed the covenant code in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the Bible. Following a common procedure, so page 45, of comparing the Christian best with the pagan worst. So that's an interesting thing. It's like saying, look how good Christianity is, and the Bible is, and look how bad the ancient Near East is. It doesn't say, look how good the Bible is, but also look how good the ancient Near East is, and is it analogous? You cherry pick the best of the Bible, forget the worst, take the best of the Bible and look at the worst of contemporary cultures and say, look how much better the Bible is. Well, yeah, of course that's going to happen, because you are really cherry picking yourself to that conclusion. Some biblical scholars use one example from Mesopotamia to characterize all non-biblical civilizations and then ignore an item from the Hittites that would offer a counter example. So Paul Copan, classic Paul Copan, moral, is got a moral monster. Is famously used by people like William Lane Craig to justify the Old Testament horrors. Who said, while Israel, this is Copan in his chapter, God is Good, Why Believing in God is Reasonable and Responsible, in William Lane Craig and Chad Meister's Are Old Testament Laws Evil? So Copan says, while Israel was commanded to offer safe harbour for foreign runaway slaves, Deuteronomy 23:15-16, Hammurabi demanded the death penalty to those helping runaway slaves, section 16. So it takes the best of the Bible and the worst of surrounding culture. And page 46, Aavlos says, it's not clear whether the penalty in the Code of Hammurabi was merely for helping runaway slaves or for stealing a slave. But even if it were true that Hammurabi called for the death penalty for anyone helping a slave to escape, we can find a non-lethal approach in Hittite Law 24, which says, quote, if a male or female slave runs away, he, she, at whose hearth her owner finds him or her, shall pay 1 month's wages, 12 shekels of silver for a man, 6 shekels of silver for a woman. End of quote. So why aren't the Hittite laws characterized as a humanizing improvement? In Law 24, a slave runs away and the person harboring the slave only pays a fine. The existence of such fines even led Copan to retreat from his earlier comparisons on the issue. When challenged on that, is Yahweh a moral monster, he actually retreats a little bit on that claim because he's been called out. Aavlos continues, in fact, Hittite law systematically replaced death penalties with fines for many offences. Thus, Law 166 demanded the death penalty for appropriating another man's farmland. But Law 167 says, but now they shall substitute one sheep for the man. In other words, the very symbol of the Christian substitutionary atonement had a preceding parallel in Hittite law. The idea that you could take a sheep and sacrifice a sheep in place of a man, the sacrificial lamb. Here we see that written into Hittite law. Whoa, that is pretty monumental. Indeed, this idea that lex talionis is this thing, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, is this biblical thing. Not only is it in Code of Hammurabi, but we see it in the Hittite law codes as well. The lex talionis is all over the ancient Near Eastern law codes. And that's a problem for certain Christian apologists. As Aavlos says on page 47, clearly Copan must engage in special pleading to convince us that the Bible represents an advancement in lex talionis. If one says that lex talionis is an advancement, then this already had a precedent in the Code of Hammurabi, Law 196. If one says replacing lex talionis with fines or sacrifices was an advancement, then the Hittites did this already. Pre-Hammurabi codes also can be found without the lex talionis principle. Laws 18 to 19, the laws of Ur-Nummu from around 2100 BCE. We also find a sympathy for slaves among the Hittites when Murshili, king of the Hittites, confronted a plague that afflicted his country. That king prayed to the gods as follows. This is a prayer from the king. If anything becomes too burdensome for a slave, he makes a plea to his master. His master hears him and pities him. Whatever is too burdensome for him, the slave, he, the master, sets right for him again. End of quote. This certainly refutes Stark's claim that in the ancient Near East there is not, quotes from Stark, any expression of the mildest sympathy for the victims of this system. It's just wrong. So Stark is just wrong. Like, he's either lying or he just hasn't done his work well enough. It's just really poor scholarship. And here's another Hittite instruction from one of the Hittite laws. And this is Aavlos's translation on page 47. The good lawsuit should not be defeated, and the bad lawsuit should not win. Do what is just. When you return to any town, call to all the people of the town. Whoever has a lawsuit, decide it for him and satisfy him. If the slave of a man, or the slave woman of a man, or a solitary woman has a suit, decide it for them and justify them. Wow. So in this Hittite law, we see there should be justice for people regardless of their status as a slave or a free person. So, even if Hittite society should not be confused with any sort of modern democracy, slaves did have the right to bring lawsuits, and judges were not supposed to show favoritism just because they were slaves, or favoritism to freed people. So Hittite law codes present a real problem for this trajectorialism as well. So now we're going to move on to Greek thought, and whether we can find other examples of non-biblical legal and moral thoughts that can help show that the Bible wasn't the sole source, font of all, the later moral progress that was made that, eventually led toward abolitionism. Or abolition. And as Aavlos says on page 48, one problem is that most apologists of biblical ethics either forget or overlook all of the Greek ideas that they would extol when voiced by Christian writers. It's such a huge problem. So what happens is when Christian writers say, and when the Bible says, hey, X and Y, where X and Y are nice moral precepts. Christian apologists say, look at this thinker, or look at this Bible quote. Isn't this wonderful? Yay, Christianity. I was like, hang on, we see them all over the shop. Greek thought, Roman thought, ancient Near Eastern thought, Far Eastern thought. Another problem is that apologists engage in a sort of detrimental representativism insofar as they assume that certain Greek laws were representative or are the only ones that existed. Consider Solon, one of the earliest Greek legal reformers. Whereas biblical scholars applaud the fact that biblical law set limits on debt slavery for Hebrews, Solon in 638 to 558 BCE, that was his life, had gone further. According to Plutarch, debt slavery was completely outlawed by Solon the Athenian. Quote, the first of his public measures was an enactment that existing debts should be remitted and that in future no one should lend money on the person or a borrower. So Solon's activities were explicitly called an act of humanity. And yet, we don't hear him lauded and applauded. We hear the Bible and Christian thought. So Athenian law, says Aavlos again on page 48, also had other provisions that were considered humanitarian advances when found in the Bible. And he goes on to quote Xenophon, shows that there are these parallels but again, when you see it in the Bible, yay, Christianity or Judaism or Judeo-Christianity. And wasn't this a great example of a necessary foundation for later moral trajectory? Well, no, because it looks like this is human moral progress because we see it outside of that context. And all this looks like is biblical exceptionalism, of course. And as Aavlos goes on page 49 to say, one cannot do justice to the study of slave law unless considering the work of Plato. The importance of Plato in Western thought is immense, and he had many concepts on slavery that would be called advances relative to biblical law. Yet Plato's opposition to enslaving fellow Greeks is dismissed by Stark as follows. Unsurprisingly, Stark again. And this is Stark from For the Glory of God, page 326. So Stark says, Plato did oppose enslavement of his fellow Hellenes, Greeks, but assigned barbarian foreign slaves a vital role in his ideal republic. They would perform all of the productive labour. In fact, the rules Plato laid out concerning the proper treatment of slaves were unusually brutal. Quote, no American slave code was so severe. While Plato believed that slaves should be sternly disciplined, he believed that to prevent needless unrest, they generally should not be subject to excessive cruelty. Back to Aavlos. The first thing we note is that Plato's willingness to enslave foreigners but not follow fellow Hellenes is precisely parallel to what we find in Hebrew law, Leviticus 25:39-46. So again, you know, this is there's a moral parallelism here. Second, Stark gives no specific examples of how Plato's treatment of slaves was more severe than anything found in any American slave code. In fact, Stark's statement depends solely on a quotation from Davis's The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture. So again, Stark is basically looking at conclusions or statements that other scholars say and either taking them out of context or misrepresenting them or using them properly, but those statements are themselves problematic. And this is what Stark does there. I won't go into details, but how Plato is basically, misunderstood. And Plato's laws, and Aavlos goes on to do a lot of discussion on Plato's laws and look at the Greek wording. I'm not going to go into all those details, but, suffice to say that, there are problems with how Christian apologists interpret and use Plato and then see Christian slavery as some kind of either a vastly superior version of slavery to Plato's understanding, or they just dismiss Plato completely. So Ramsay MacMullen, and so this is page 51 for Aavlos, talking about scholar Ramsay MacMullen, who wrote Christianity and Paganism in the 4th to 8th centuries. So Ramsay MacMullen specifically notes the relatively greater religious freedom enjoyed by pagan slaves compared to slaves under Christianity in late antiquity. Moreover, any sort of friendliness between slaves and masters in America did not necessarily improve treatment of slaves. And he goes on to talk about how slaves in North America, in the antebellum South or whatever, in America in general, they were beaten like dogs. And on the one hand, on one day you might have a joke with your slave master, and the next day they'll just beat you like a dog. It was just like, and so the idea is that if you're talking about trajectory, the point here is that actually the type of slavery we see in North America before abolition under Christian slave owners, I mean, this was effectively a Christian empire, was worse than the slavery evidence in ancient Greece. And that's a problem if you are advancing this trajectorial understanding of the Bible and Christian ethics. page 52 says, Plato's laws have related to physical assaults by slaves. American laws could be much worse for violations that did not involve any sort of physical assault by slaves. So Plato laid out these laws where, like, if a slave assaults you, then you can do X, Y, and Z. And yet American slave laws under Christian thought set out that you could exact violence upon slaves for non-physical things. So actually, this is evidence that slavery in America was worse. Many statutes in America severely punish slaves merely for any verbal or other types of insolence. According to the North Carolina law in 1852, insolence may be difficult to define, but it could include, quote, a look, a pointing of a finger, a refusal to step out of the way when a white person is seen to approach. And you get these ideas that, the trajectory goes the other way. Before you get abolition, Christian abolition, you get Christian slavery, and Christian slavery was worse than previous types of slavery. In other words, it's really difficult to argue for the moral superiority of Christianity. And it goes on to say, likewise, what Ben Witherington, so another famous sort of Christian apologist and scholar, applauds about Colossians 4:1 is similar to what we find in Plato. And he talks about, so Ben Witherington says, look how wonderful Colossians 1 is, and this Pauline idea of, slavery. And it's like, yeah, well, we see that in Plato's laws. So this isn't like a wonderful Christian thing. In another case, and he goes on to analyze that, but for wanting to be a little more efficient with my time, in another case, Plato treats the murder of a slave the same as the murder of a free citizen. Okay, so that's interesting, and he goes on to give the Plato's law there. And then comments, similarly, the involuntary manslaughter of a free man requires, quote, the same purifications as the man that has killed a slave. Okay, so this is interesting, morally speaking. Of course, biblical scholars, he says, usually pass over in silence any advances Plato made over earlier or other Greek laws. For example, there is evidence that Plato, in contrast to some earlier laws, allowed slaves to give testimony without torture, while Athenian law allowed emancipation of slaves when they acted as informants concerning misappropriated treasure or the neglect of parents. Plato laws 9.881c adds emancipation for assisting parents who are being attacked by their children. This is unparalleled in biblical law. In other words, some of Plato's slavery laws are definitely improvements on biblical laws. Again, invalidating the trajectory understanding. What we also see is ideas of, you might see ideas of sexism, chauvinism in say, Plato's laws. And that's picked up, of course, by certain Christians, and as Aavlos says, as elitist and chauvinistic as these ideas might seem, they are no worse than what we find in the Bible. So he talks about how, Plato says that men should rule women because, quote, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior. Well, in the Bible, just like that, was it Hittite law code from earlier, we have literally the value of a man is twice that of a woman in terms of shekels. So that's in the Bible. We have all sorts of quotes all over the Bible. There is plenty of evidence of outright sexism in the Bible. I don't need to go into it. What is not usually publicized, says Aavlos on page 54, is that Aristotle, so we're now talking about Aristotle later, also had ideas of equality that were applauded by scholars such as Richard Horsley and Ben Witherington when found in biblical texts. Again, we come back to this issue that when you see these moral proclamations in the Bible, it's amazing But when you see them in pre-existing non-biblical literature, you ignore them. It's the Bible, right? So as Aavlos says on page 55, again, discussing how you find these moral improvements in Greek thought, but they're ignored and they're lauded when seen in Christian thoughts, talking about Pauline thought. And he goes on to say, this powerful distinction was dismissed by Paul and later Christian thinkers, as Finlay observed, so a scholar, quote, and this is from Ancient Slavery and Modern Ideology, page 189, by a scholar called Finlay. Apart from the injection of original sin into the concept of natural slavery, neither the New Testament nor the Church Fathers added anything significant to the rhetoric of the Roman Stoics. Wow. And that kind of brings us on to Roman thought. And again, it's the same sort of stuff. So, page 55, Aavlos says, as I shall show later, many of the advances that Rodney Stark credits to Catholic law in Louisiana, the idea that it had a particularly Catholic flavour to its laws, that he argues led to abolition, actually originated in Roman law. Yet we never hear Stark praising Roman law for planting the seeds of abolition or greater liberality in at least some parts of the Americas. Oh, how wonderful Christianity is, and we'll just ignore where we find evidence of these same things outside of Christianity. So Coombs, a biblical scholar, concludes that, quote, even if the church approved or even encouraged the manumission of slaves, it would be doing nothing more humane or radical for its time. So this is to do with sort of Roman law. So let's say that again. Even if the church approved or even encouraged the manumission of slaves, so at the time the church suddenly said, "Yeah, let's get rid of slaves," it would have been doing nothing humane or radical for its time. In other words, that's the kind of prevailing thought that was going on in ancient Rome, and that was according to Coombs, a scholar in the metaphor of slavery. So Rome, this is Aavlos on page 56, saw a clear development of a peculium tradition, which allowed the slave to accumulate property and funds which could be used to purchase freedom. The peculium figured quite prominently in places such as Latin America and Louisiana, where the Roman tradition was continued by the Latin America and by the Catholic Church. The peculium tradition in Louisiana helps to explain the larger proportion of free black people relative to Protestant slaveholding states. Nonetheless, Stark and others persist in crediting Christianity for something originating with the Romans. So Stark says, oh, look at this amazing, progress that we see in Louisiana, forgetting that Louisiana was more Catholic and all these other states were more Protestant. So he rolls that up into Christianity as one monolithic thing and congratulates Louisiana as in some kind of Christian way, whereas actually you could argue that it's because it's Roman Catholic, and actually some of its tenets are based on Roman law that have existed in thought previously, such as this peculium tradition. And, you got Seneca. About 2,000 years before Martin Luther King, Seneca said, I propose to value slaves according to their character and not according to their duties. So this idea that there's a vision of a kind of equality of all humans, made equal. Seneca should be seen as a modern egalitarian, says Aavlos on page 57, but rather than his pronouncements on egalitarianism, can be considered to be just as much as an advance if we judge him by the standards apologists applied to biblical materials. Why isn't Seneca lauded? Because it's not convenient for Christians to do so. And after all, no one probably enslaved more people than Christian empires did in terms of absolute numbers. So this idea that terrible slavery was outside of the Christian empire, it's like A, it wasn't as terrible, and B, there were way more slaves under the Christian empire. So that's a bit of a problem. And Aavlos goes on towards the end of the chapter to talk about imago Dei, so made in the image of God, and this idea that it's only that only comes through through biblical ethics. So the idea that everyone's made in the image of God means that we're all equal. And of course Seneca, and other thinkers exhibit these same sorts of thoughts. And he goes on to look at Mesopotamian. So Aavlos looks at the idea that some of those thoughts made in the image of God obviously pre-existed Bible in terms of sort of Mesopotamian myths or cultures. So yeah, I won't go into too much detail there, but the quote from page 58 from Aavlos: "Thus, if we use the trajectory approach, we could say that Christianity was merely a station in a long march to freedom that the Mesopotamians began." So when they're talking about made in the image of God in Mesopotamian myth, and then they have some of those legal codes, we go back to that first graph again. We are talking about the idea that the Bible sits within the context of the cultures it existed within and that came before. It's as simple as that. And so really to summarize, to finish this off, because it's been a long one, sorry, Aavlos says on page 59, ironically, many modern apologists who denigrate Near Eastern ethics seem to overlook how positively those cultures were used by critics of slavery of the last 500 years. So this is really interesting. So in general, we see that at least two ways in which Near Eastern cultures were used to show, one, that even non-Christians perceived injustices Christians did not, and two, how much better Near Eastern cultures treated slaves compared with Americans. So the idea that many Christian apologists will attack ancient Near Eastern cultures as being, far more brutal and the biblical ethics were a massive step in the right direction towards abolition. Actually, many more critical scholars will say, not only is that not the case, that we see many of these ideas pre-existing in ancient Near Eastern cultures, and that the Bible just used them and then added to them, so it's just another stepping stone in that trajectory. But actually there's evidence that things were better in certain contexts, and certainly arguably better than in slavery in North America in the Christian empire of the last sort of 400 years. So that, I think that's pretty interesting. He goes on to talk about certain thinkers as Morgan Godwin, an Anglican missionary in the sort of 1600s, talking about the ancient sort of scenario being better. And you got, of course, Confucius. The Golden Rule pre-existed. The Golden Rule as we see it from Jesus by a good 500 years. And interestingly, Frederick Douglass, the famous slave who became a free man, was, talked about the Confucius predating Jesus in that by that time frame. And Aavlos says on page 60, these comparisons with China are also interesting insofar as most of the scholars who compare biblical ethics to those of other cultures hardly ever think of anything east of the Near East. That's what I said earlier. So here's summary. I'm going to read out the summary and that'll finish us off. So the summary on page 61, Aavlos says, glorifying the superiority of biblical ethics, especially in regard to slavery, relies routinely on devaluing the legal and cultural accomplishments of the cultures of the ancient Near East that neighboured Israel. In addition, many of the claims about these cultures are based on a very superficial acquaintance with the actual sources from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Anatolia. Stark, for example, depends on secondary sources for many of his sweeping indictments of non-Christian cultures. Orlando Patterson completely misrepresented a secondary source he did cite. Once we examine those primary Near Eastern sources, we do not find much that is new in Christianity, and we find many Near Eastern advantages that the Bible did not offer slaves. The biblical idea that human beings were made in the image of God, imago Dei, did not really have much practical effect on the ethics of slavery compared to what we find in the Near East. If Christianity made any advances, it would not be because it was original, but because it reverted to pagan practices that preceded it. Wow. So, that's a look at not only the way that the apologists and scholars have done a bad job, but it looks at the context of the ancient Near East and Greece and Rome and, or the Roman Empire and Egypt, and we have thought that pre-existed the Bible and Christian thought that was either better or parallel to Christian thought. And then we have instances of slavery and laws that were far better than the slavery laws we saw in America, which happened, thousands of years later. So, yeah, the whole idea that we have this trajectory that moves towards abolition and that Christian thought was, or the Bible was the starting point to this trajectory is hugely problematic. And Aavlos amply disabuses or should disabuse Christian thinkers of these conclusions, of their conclusions, because they're just untenable. Anyway, thanks for listening. That was a long one, part 3, and lots of quotes, but I hope it was in some way useful. Remember, this is just as kind of a book club video. Anyway, let us know what your thoughts are in the comments. Please like, subscribe, share, and do all that stuff and help my channel. And as ever, question everything, particularly yourselves.